This was a meeting that I chaired, but at one point it listed as Vice Chair Travis called for public testimony, where it should state Vice Chair Burns. That's page 2.
Which meeting was that again?
March 12th, page 2, minor correction.
Anyone else?
No.
Okay. With that, so we have one correction to March 12th, 2019. I'll entertain a motion to approve the notes as amended.
I would like to make a motion all in the year of 2019 for April 9th, May 14th, November 12th, December 10th as written, and March 12th as amended.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Notes are approved. Next on the agenda, information items. Are there any informational items from staff?
I don't have any other than the library is open and it's really cool.
Yes.
Applause for that. It is very cool. Thank you. It's great to be part of that, even though we, played somewhat minor role, but it's nice to see something that we approved that is now open and ready for public use. So it's very nice. So next, we do have a section for audience participation, and this is it's an opportunity to comment on items that are not on tonight's agenda. So if you're here to comment on the comprehensive plan, we will have time for that. But this is an opportunity for someone who wants to comment on an item that is not on the agenda. Doesn't look like we have anyone. Okay, great. Well, then next, we will move right into the public hearing on the comprehensive plan draft policy document. Can you remind me, is that a type 5? Of course it is, yes, okay. The public hearing on file CPA-2019-001 is called to order. The purpose of this hearing is to consider legislative amendments to the City of Milwaukee's comprehensive plan. I will recognize those persons who have completed the testimony cards and given them to me. When you come to the podium, please state your name and address for the record so they may be entered into the minutes. If you're here to testify, please remember to confine your remarks to the application and the relevant criteria and to avoid repetition and irrelevant information. So next is commissioner participation. Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to declare an actual or potential conflict of interest?
No.
No.
Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to abstain?
No.
Then let's proceed to the staff report presentation.
All right. Thank you, Chair Travis, Commissioners. David Levitan, Senior Planner here with the City of Milwaukee. So we are here tonight to hold a public hearing to consider to begin the process for the Planning Commission to make a recommendation on adoption of the comprehensive plan policy document. I'm going to give a little bit of background information. I know we've had a number of meetings on this, more than a number of meetings, work sessions, outreach, but for people that haven't been involved, I'm going to give a brief history of the project and then move into some of the key issues. And then, what we're really here tonight is, the focus of the public hearing tonight is to take testimony from the public and then to begin discussion on some of the items and some of the edits and just to gather input from the Planning Commission on what they think of the document. So, basically, the comprehensive plan update, the comprehensive plan is the city's primary land use document. It's implemented through ordinances such as the zoning code as well, and also programs. The last major update was in 1989, so it's a little bit of a stale document. We've had kind of minor amendments since then with moving forward Milwaukee and other projects, North Milwaukee Innovation Area. But really the council, following adoption of the community vision back in fall of 2017, wanted the city to move directly into an update to the comprehensive plan to really look holistically at the document and to do a wholesale rewrite of the goals and policies. A comprehensive plan update is an amendment to the comprehensive plan, so it's a type 5 legislative amendment. So the Planning Commission's role is to make a recommendation to the City Council that then adopts any amendments via council ordinance. So what are we updating? Basically, a decision was made kind of early in the process that the initial focus was going to be on the policy document. So that's the introduction, the goals and policies, a lot of the background information, and then we would be moving forward with amendments, potential amendments to the comprehensive plan land use map at a later point. I would also like to point out that while we're updating the majority of the goals and policies, we are not at this point updating the transportation goals and policies. The decision was made that we wanted to do an update to the transportation system plan, the TSP, which would then be incorporated into the comprehensive plan. So just to go a little bit over how we've been, the process to update the document. The policy work was broken up into 4 blocks, approximately 6 months each. Policies, there were typically 2 to 4 topic areas per block, with the exception of housing, which was its own block of work. At the end of each block of work, policies were pinned down by council resolution, which basically was a process to acknowledge that the council was generally comfortable with the policies but wasn't ready to adopt them by ordinance, and wanted to have, kind of a full set of public hearings before the Planning Commission and the City Council to consider all of the goals and policies at once, because they are very much interrelated. Didn't want to be adopting them by ordinance without really considering all of the different topic areas. The last several months, so basically that process ended kind of in late summer of 2019, and then over the course of the last 3 to 4 months, the focus has been on production of the actual policy document, so writing the introduction, the background sections, developing the maps, graphics. As I did at the last work session, I want to commend Assistant Planner Mary Heberlein for pulling this document together. She's done an excellent job. We've done most of this in-house, which is definitely a Herculean effort on her part, and so I just wanted to reiterate what a great job I think she's done. We made all of the goals and policies we published on the city's website in late October of 2019 to start collecting public comment. And then in early December, we issued a notice to DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and to Metro, our regional government. We're required to issue notice 35 days before the first evidentiary public hearing. We're required to notice those agencies and to make a draft of the document available. So on that same date, which was, I think that was on December 8th, we made a copy of the comprehensive plan policy document available on the city website as well. We've since have updated that a couple times as we've received comments from the Planning Commission, from the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee, and the City Council, but it's largely stayed the same. We basically have just been adding in some additional graphics, and then we have since a series of meetings, which I'll go into in December, we have incorporated a lot of copy edits. We've rewritten parts of the introduction. So there have been edits that have been made since December, but in general, the document is pretty similar. So just a little bit of a summary of public engagement for the process. We've started in late 2017 was when our first CPAC, or Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee, meeting was. And since that time, we have had 24 meetings with the CPAC, and I'd like to point out that several members of the CPAC are here tonight, and I see have turned in yellow cards, and it's been an incredible process with them. They've dedicated just dozens, if not hundreds of hours of their spare time to produce this document. And I just wanted to give special thanks to that group because yeah, it's. I think the document is very representative of a broad cross-section of the community, a lot of different interests, a lot of different expertise, and so it wouldn't be nearly the document without them. So we've, in addition to the CPAC meetings, we've had 3 town halls and 2 open houses. Accompanying those events, in-person events, we've had 4 online open houses or community surveys. We've done outreach at different points of the process with the neighborhood district associations, or NDAs. We've had focus groups with several environmental organizations, with several Spanish-speaking residents here in Milwaukee to broaden our outreach to be more inclusive and equitable. And then we've had, I think I noted at the last work session, I think we'd had 13 work sessions with the Planning Commission and 19 check-ins with the City Council. So we've been before the community in a number of different forums, probably more than they wanted to see us. So. Just a summary of document review. So as I noted, in late October, October 23rd, the policies were posted for public review, and then the document, the entire document with the introduction and kind of the early draft of the graphics was posted on December 5th. The Planning Commission held a work session on December 10th, which was followed by meetings with the CPAC and the City Council the following week. Each of those, the Planning Commission, the CPAC, and the Council all provided incredible comments on the first draft of the document, which have largely been incorporated into it. We're still continuing to make some kind of minor copy edits and incorporate some additional graphics, which Mary, Assistant Planner Mary Heberlin, can go into if there's any questions about that as far as items that are still being addressed. But we think that the document's in pretty good shape right now. So just a brief summary of some of the major items that have been changed since the Planning Commission last saw the document on December 10th. We tried to add more and a better variety of photos. There were a number of general copy edits to the text just to provide consistency in terms and capitalization, things along those lines. We got some good feedback, not just from the Planning Commission, but from the City Council and the CPAC, that there were concerns about, a couple sections of the introduction. So got some good information from Commissioner Hemer and from some other sources and rewrote that. So we'd be interested to see how the Planning Commission feels about that now. Added an acknowledgements section as well as acronyms. We wanted to make sure that people knew what some of these CPAC, PC, all these different terms meant, all the different acronyms, and then also to make sure that there was proper acknowledgement for all the hard work from just the various stakeholders here in the Milwaukee community. We tried to underline words throughout the document that are featured in the glossary, just to try to tie that in. I think there's an opportunity in the future to hyperlink that then, some of those sections to the glossary, just to provide, or to hover over it, just to make the document a little bit more accessible and easier to get that information. And then we've added a number of maps and infographics that were kind of placeholders at the time back in December. And so since early December, when the document was made available online, it was posted on the city website, on the project websites. People were informed via social media, through the project's email list, which is up to about 600 people on it now. We've received, as of the time, well, let me rephrase this. In your packet, in attachment, I think it's, actually, let me see which attachment it is. But in your packet, you'll find that there were 8 comment letters included. Those were the comment letters that were received by January 1st. Staff has provided a matrix of those comments and city responses and recommendations within attachment 3, and then has included it within attachment 4, proposed track change edits based on those public comments. Since January 1st, we've received an additional 6 sets of public comments between January 3rd and January 13th. Our plan is to take oral testimony tonight to discuss these initial sets of comments, But then we will also be having a public hearing we're proposing to continue the public hearing to January 28th. So in between now and then, we'll be providing responses to the 6 additional sets of comments that have been received, and any comments that we receive tonight, and any comments that we receive in advance of that meeting. And we'll be adding that to the matrix and providing that in the January 28th packet. So I'm going to go through a couple of the key issues. I'm going to be brief because these are included within the staff report, but we had called out 4 key issues within the staff report. The first was, should the Planning Commission serve as the city's Community Involvement Advisory Committee? So as noted in the staff report and as required by statewide planning goal 1, that cities are required to have what's called a CCI. It's essentially a committee for community involvement or citizen involvement, different terms for it. And there have been kind of extensive discussions about who should serve, which body should serve within that role. Should it be a standalone body? Should it be the Planning Commission? This was included within Block 1 of the project, so we kind of developed these policies. It seems like forever ago, but it was only early 2018, a much simpler time. But we have had discussions with the CPAC, with the Planning Commission, with City Council, and the general direction from Council has been for the Planning Commission to serve within that CCI, what we're calling a CIAC role, just given your expertise in land use and transportation planning, and that the CIAC that's called out in statewide planning goal 1 is specifically related to land use and transportation issues. So we thought it made more sense, and the council thought it made more sense for the Planning Commission, which already serves in that advisory role, to the City Council to serve in that CIAC role as well. So we, I think, brought that up at the last work session as well, but that is our current recommendation. There are some proposed edits within the comments from members of the public that would like to see it as a separate body, so that's something that I would anticipate we'll hear more about tonight and that we would like to get feedback from the Planning Commission. The second one is related to the land use designations. So basically, in the existing comprehensive plan, Chapter 4 is the land use chapter. It covers a variety of different topics: housing, economic development, parks and recreation. And there's a series of probably almost 100 policies that cover all the different land use designations within the city. So basically, the land use designations are kind of general categories of land use. So high density residential, medium density residential, low density residential, different types of commercial uses, industrial, manufacturing. So what we've tried to do within this is to centralize those in one location. In doing that, we kind of very much simplified them into a pretty short list of characteristics, and also called out the implementing zoning districts for those land use designations. There were some comments from the public that felt that they maybe weren't specific enough as far as calling out the individual density ranges for each of those zoning districts. So you'll see within attachment 4 that we're recommending some minor edits just to provide additional clarity as far as which zoning ranges apply to which zoning districts, just so that it's a little bit more clear as far as how that works. The third issue is actually one that's whether there should be a policy calling for a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. This is something that came out of the 2017 community vision. There is an existing action item, policy 1.7, within the vision that calls for creating a new DEI committee. And as we were developing the goals and policies within Section 1 for community engagement, there was pretty much consensus from the CPAC that they felt that this should be included within the comprehensive plan as well as a policy. We've had that discussion with the Planning Commission and the City Council, as well as with the City Manager's Office. And the direction that staff has been provided from the Council and from the City Manager's Office to date is that they feel that that is more appropriate for the community vision because it covers issues really that extend far beyond land use. And so that's something within your recommendation, I would encourage you to focus on, see how you feel about staff's recommendation on that and how you would like to treat that in your ultimately in your recommendation to City Council. And then finally, the last key issue that we identified are there policies related to limiting development in natural hazard areas? Are the policies related to limiting development in natural areas too restrictive? So as we've been doing some of the policy work, we've also been starting to think about updates to Title 18 of the Municipal Code, which covers development within the floodplain. And we basically did some internal review, and we identified specifically policies 5.1.3 and 5.4.1 that deal not just with floodplain, but general, how restrictive, should we be prohibiting development? Should we be restricting? Should we be limiting? There were a lot of very in-depth discussions on what the appropriate verbiage for these policies were. And in doing our internal review, we had identified policy 5.4.1 that it's the way that it was currently written, that it seemed like it was limiting development within the floodplain and in other natural hazard areas, that it should basically show a public benefit and could be perceived as being limited to public uses. And so we are proposing some very minor edits to that policy 5.4.1 to make it clear that it applies to not just public uses.
I'm sorry, David, could you explain what Title 18 means?
So Title 18 is just a section of the municipal code. So Title 19 is the zoning code. So there's different titles within the Milwaukee Municipal Code. We deal primarily within Title 19, and we also deal with Title 14, which is signs, Title 17, which is kind of subdivisions. But Title 18 deals specifically with floodplains and regulations related to floodplains. So we're being required, we received a grant from FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, to work with, and we've been working with DLCD on updating our code. And so as we've been starting to think about some of that code work and some of those code amendments that will be coming before you in 2020, we wanted to make sure that there weren't any conflicts with the comprehensive plan policies. And so, as far as tonight, the main focus of tonight is to allow the public to provide oral testimony on the document. There isn't anything within the bylaws that specifically state the amount of time to be given to members of the public, but the general strategy for city council meetings has been to provide 3 minutes per person for public testimony and then 10 minutes per group or an individual that's representing a group. So that is our recommendation for this evening. Depending on the amount of time that it takes to get through the public comments, that will influence the amount of discussion that we start to have amongst the planning commissioners. And really, if we do have time, we'd like to start to have an initial discussion and get some initial feedback on some of the policy language, on items within the document that you think are still missing or need to be amended. And then our plan at the end of tonight is to continue the public hearing until January 28th and allow people to provide testimony at that meeting as well. And then as far as next steps leading up to the January 28th meeting and beyond, as I previously mentioned, our plan is to provide responses to oral testimony that we received tonight, as well as written comments that we're going to incorporate that into the policy matrix that we've developed and the preliminary list of staff responses and recommendations. Make additional edits to the policy document based on Planning Commission feedback, and then on January 28th, review kind of what we've heard so far, what we've heard from the community, start to discuss findings. We are required to make findings as required by Title 19 of the Milwaukee Municipal Code. We're also required to have findings that address Metro and DLCD or LCDC specifically require findings to show compliance with the statewide planning goals and with Metro's urban growth management functional plan, which drafts of which are included within your packet tonight. And then depending on the amount of feedback that we get on January 28th, the preliminary plan is to have the Planning Commission make a recommendation to City Council on February 11th.
I just want to be clear for technical aspects. Is in a 5 hearing, are we allowed to leave the public hearing open and have Planning Commission give you advice, or do we have to close the public testimony portion and then it sounds like that we'd have to reopen it at the next meeting?
There's a lot of discussion about this today among us. And you can discuss the topics. This is a legislative item. I mean, you could have had discussions in your living room last night with the commissioners, and there isn't anything wrong with that because it's legislative. The decision you make and the deliberation you make should be in public, or has to be in public, but it's you have a lot more flexibility with a legislative decision than you do with a quasi-judicial decision, which is what we mostly deal with. With that, we think that you can talk generally about the policies, but you shouldn't be making any preliminary decisions tonight necessarily. You can just kind of give us some feedback on them, give the public some feedback about where you are, basically. But I don't think you want to make a decision up or down. At one point today, we were thinking that we were going to ask for that on certain aspects of the proposal before you. But after some discussion, we thought, given that one of your members is missing who feels strongly about the natural resource component, that we probably ought to wait and deal with, that we ought to have everybody here. If we can have everybody here next time and you can actually deliberate at that point.
And I'll also say, I think that it'll be productive if we can give some feedback tonight about things that we want to have further explanation, or we'd like staff to look into certain topics, or, if there are, some questions that are unanswered, I think that that's productive to move us forward. But also, I think we don't want to rehash the same conversation at the next meeting on the 28th. And I think certain topics Commissioner Edge is really interested in, and we'd like to be able to incorporate that as well. So, we want to be able to continue moving forward, and so we think that, use the time to give some initial feedback and get our questions answered, and then have more of a deliberation when we have everyone here.
I want to correct something I said. You could have discussions about this in your living room with other people. You couldn't get a quorum of planning commissioners in your living room.
So 3 or less planning commissioners, right?
But I wanted to say no one was in Commissioner Hemer's living room last night.
As far as you know.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions for David at this point?
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so I would like to have all the yellow cards. Thank you. And these two are folded together. Does that mean you're a group?
Seated minutes.
Seated minutes. Okay.
Seated their 3 minutes.
Somebody seated their 3 minutes. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to follow the recommendation for 3 minutes per individual, and up to 10 minutes for individuals that are representing a group or multiple people. So, and Commissioner Burns is going to help me. We have the timer up here, but appreciate everyone, giving us your feedback at this point, and appreciate all the investment of your time in reviewing this very hefty document. So we're glad that you're here and look forward to hearing your comments, and hopefully we'll be able to proceed through this and get some good feedback at this point. I would also, before we begin, like to say that I'm incredibly proud of the work of the CPAC, incredibly proud to be part of it, and those 24 meetings, I would have said it only felt like maybe 22. So, I mean, we spent a lot of time together, a lot of quality time, and
You did miss a couple, Kim.
Okay, maybe that's why it was only 20. But such an honor to work with dedicated citizens that are volunteering their time for this cause, and I think we all learned a lot together, and just really appreciate all of that. So I wanted to say that before we dig in here. But okay, so we're going to get started with Mr. Aschenbrenner. So if you come on up and state your name and address for the record, that'd be great.
For timekeeping purposes, are you here representing yourself as an individual or one of the groups you're affiliated with?
Well, it's I'm going to go on the individual thing. I'm hopefully going to whip through this really fast. But as you all know, I'm involved in several community groups, but I'm not actually speaking directly for them, but indirectly. So, Dave Aschenbrenner, 11505 Southeast Home Avenue. I'm going to try to whip through this really fast in my 3 minutes. So, first off, thanks to you and all the people that are involved in putting this nice document together. It's quite a read. So, on policy 2.1.1, on the cultural resources map, it does not list the Milwaukee Historical Society, the Milwaukee Museum. I was kind of hoping that the Historical Society would be a historical reference for the city, and I think it's mentioned once in the entire document. I would hope that that would get updated a little bit and include in there. Also on that, I believe it's on that historical list, and several of them, there are several numbered spots on there, but I don't know what they are. I didn't seem to find a list to what are the historical resources inventory. There's a 10, a 21, a 14, a 23. I didn't see easily to find a list of what all those are. And I hope one of those would be the Milwaukee Museum.
Okay.
I have a question about policy 3, where you're talking about 14% growth by 2014. And my question is how are those numbers tracked? When did we start counting that 14%, which I would rather see a number than a percentage? If we're trying to get a 14% more growth than from what date to what date if we're shooting for 2024? Is that a number of units? What are we talking about when that 14%? It would be nice to see a real number, and from when to when are we tracking that number? The next question is the units per acre. Did those numbers change at all from where they were for R10 and R7 at 6.2 and R5 at 7 to 8.7 units? I'm curious if those numbers have been adjusted up or down in that one, because I didn't see any reference to old numbers were this, new numbers are that. I'm just going to skip the boundary map because we're already working on that on a different front. The wetlands inventory, 3.2.1. Minthorn Pond and Minthorn Creek are the ponds in there. I don't know the creeks is listed in there. I have some concerns about the outflow of Minthorn Pond wetlands, that it actually should flow into Minthorn Creek, and I don't know that it does. Am I out of time already?
We'll just, I'll give you a couple more minutes.
Give me a couple
Yep,
more? Okay,
yep.
so Minthorn Pond. Also, Minthorn Pond is in the buildable lands map. I don't think Minthorn Pond is a buildable land. It does not include Triangle Park at 37th and Monroe. The tree policy, it would be nice if the street tree portion of the tree policy gave residents 1 year to replace a street tree when one's taken out, and that it is enforced. Density impacts, my biggest concern there is setbacks. I prefer that setbacks are not changed. That really enforces the closeness and ability of a homeowner to have their piece of real estate when your neighbor all of a sudden is building right on the property line right behind you. That setbacks are really important. If you're going to waive SDC charges, how are you going to build the infrastructure? I'd like to define close proximity and define walking space, walking distance. What are those? What are you, when you say close proximity is 50 feet? 2 miles, what are we considering that? And then street parking with, if we're not having on-street park or having a lot of on-street parking, how parking is going to be enforced. Outside of downtown, we have a parking person in downtown. We are relying on police to do, when they can, parking enforcement outside of downtown. If we're eliminating off-street parking, then that's going to be in a lot more cars on the street, and that I think parking needs to be looked at that too. So other than that, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pretty good document. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and I'll take any questions if you have any.
Anybody?
I have one for Mr. Aschenbrenner. You were talking about the units per acre, and are they the same? Do you have a reference point of when, what the reference point is that you were looking for?
No, I don't. I don't know what the.
Was it from last comp plan, or was it from?
I would think probably from the last comp plan, or from where we're defining what an R10 is as how many units per acre presently, and I don't know if they changed when they come into this document, if that number changed at all, if it went up or down, increasing the density of an R10.
Okay.
So, anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You know the answer to that, don't you?
Okay.
Hey, can we answer that question
Yeah, sure.
right now?
Yeah, so as far as the densities, with the exception of the high-density residential, which would be implemented through the R1 and the R1B zones, the density ranges are the same as in the existing comprehensive plan. The zoning and the density ranges have been the same within the zoning code as well. The one exception is the R1 and the R1B. In the existing 1989 comprehensive plan, I believe it has 21 to 24 units per acre is what's listed within the comprehensive plan land use for high-density residential. At some point between 1989 and I think 1995, the zoning code was amended to show a minimum density of 25 units per acre and a maximum density of 32 units per acre. So we've kind of had an inconsistency between the zoning code and the comprehensive plan for these last probably 25 years. And so what we're proposing is the one section that we are proposing to amend within the land use designations is for high-density residential to have it match what the actual density range is for the R1 and R1B within the existing zoning code. So we're proposing to change that to 25 to 32 units per acre.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, next up, Celestina DeMaro. Sorry, my last name. Great.
I'm just representing myself. Hi, I'm Celestina, 9557 Southeast 32nd Avenue. Thank you all for all your work. I was on the CPAC, and so most of my input has already been given for this document, but on the item, well, I'm going to echo support for part of what's in addendum number 1. pages 8 and 9, comments submitted by Ben Rousseau on 2 edits with regard to definitions and description of equity. One is in the glossary, and one is in our housing background summary. It's summarized pretty well there, so I won't go into it, but I'm voicing my support of that. And then with regard to the question on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and whether or not we should have a policy in the comp plan for that, I'd like to comment, and I think that there should be a policy that identifies the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee as being necessary as a body to inform equity in land use decisions. I think that we reference many other specialty committees, commissions, and regional bodies whose interests are not strictly land use, but whose interests inform land use throughout the document. And it's clear in the vision that the city needs a specialized committee to adequately address and advance equity in our city, including in our land use decisions. So, as it does not yet exist, but is necessary to responsibly implement the comp plan, I think it is perfectly appropriate for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee's establishment be included as a policy in the comp plan. It is a specifically different document than the vision and has a lot more impact on how the city moves forward with land use, and I think it is an appropriate place to reinforce that that's part of the city's plan for the next 20 years. Thanks. Do you have any questions?
I do.
Okay.
So if you could help me clarify,
Yes.
how does the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee tie into land use?
Oh, okay. I wasn't ready for that, but let's do it. So on almost every level, regulating housing size, form, density, access, affordability, which are not every single one of those is strictly land use, but many of them are, impacts different people in different ways. And so if we're not informing our land use decisions to be actively equitable, history has shown that they end up being actively inequitable, and that they only prioritize the impacts of their decisions, the impacts of the decisions as they impact people who are more privileged in the community. So by not considering equity, you might make a decision that inadvertently or intentionally is inequitable.
So you would see this committee as that would have a role on giving recommendations to land use policies on these particular 3 issues.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Ken Kreska, come on down.
Thank you. Thank you. How are you guys doing tonight?
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, well, thanks for meeting with me. So I'm representing myself and, like the other guy, informally, roughly a couple dozen other community members, many of them my neighbors. My name's Ken Kraska, Milwaukee. I'm in the Ardenwald neighborhood. So I put together here a packet. The first 3 pages summarize the suggested things I'd like to make. But first, I'll just make my statement. So first of all, I'd like to start by thanking the Planning Department staff, the CPAC members, and the Planning Commission for their hard work thus far on this major overhaul. It's been an honor to weigh in on such a great effort up to this point. So in the public comments matrix in your packets, which, excuse me, just getting over a cold, which staff meticulously compiled, there's support for some of the comments received, particularly the clarity on the land use designations, which I appreciate.
However, unfortunately, many of the public comments received were dismissed, in my view, by staff, often with little to no substantive explanation or justification for those characterizations. So we believe it is important to consider that interpretation of the intent, meaning, and/or quality of current and proposed policy language is not the sole province of staff. Indeed, it is specifically the Planning Commission's charge, in collaboration with the public, to ensure that the intent and goals of policy are effectively adjusted, expanded, and/or clarified to facilitate effective implementation. We ask and trust that you will be comprehensive in your consideration and representation as you deliberate on the existing language, as well as incorporation of public comments into this plan. And I'll touch on a few of the 37 points I have here, but not all of them. I'll trust that you can look those over as you have time. But a couple things that aren't in there is the timeline. And I know some of you, some of the commissioners have already brought this up. There's been this idea of this speedy timeline that I think has been generated by staff, that, you know, we have these 3 days, today, 2 weeks from now, and 2 weeks from that, and then it's over. But we have, the state law doesn't constrain us until the spring of 2022 to wrap this up. Not saying we should wait that long, but certainly this is a pretty involved thing. You guys have put a lot of work into it, and I'd like to see some robust discussion and debate around this, and not just rush this through hastily. There needs to be specificity in the comp plan. It's very important. Someone previously mentioned the vision plan versus the comp plan, and where should it be located? Well, the vision plan is largely aspirational. The vision plan allows a lot of room for interpretation and flexibility. And in talking with some of the CPAC members, and in their letter in attachment 5, they indicate that decisions were often made with dissent, and they felt themselves that there need to be some changes, additional changes made. And I think some of them will probably speak to that today here in the meeting. But my view is we should err on the side of being more specific rather than overly vague or general. That's probably one of my main comments. I feel I agree with the Resource Council, the Watershed Council, who put comments in, that natural hazards, we should err on the side of caution when it comes to natural hazards, and we should not be afraid of using words like prohibit when it comes to things like that. If I may just go slightly longer, I'll try to just hit some of the key points here under my summary of suggestions. I think preservation of large and old growth trees is important, as do many of my neighbors. An idea that we've been bouncing around that's been done in other localities here is to create fee schedules that are tied to building demolitions. This will help to mitigate some of the effects of that. Try to avoid rather than simply reduce natural hazard potentials. Let's see. Limit eminent domain to public projects only when it comes to conservation. Again, large trees. Going along with some of the city council members to consider using an incremental approach to development that focuses equally on form and density, especially in residential neighborhoods. There's this trend now in planning, I'm sure you guys are familiar with it, it's called form-based code, and it was started by some architects in Chicago. But and it's well lauded by developers. But my concern is that we need to not disregard density as well, because it has a real impact on what happens in terms of traffic congestion, air pollution, noise pollution, even environmental considerations. Some of the most affordable homes are those that already exist, and so rather than just scrape and replace, which is what we're seeing in Portland, I would like to see Milwaukee kind of stand out a little, not just be an appendage of Portland, and taking a unique viewpoint, which we already have. A lot of the environmental actions in here and some of the other pragmatic steps are I think, unique to Milwaukee. So I would encourage you to continue in that direction.
Just a couple more, and then we'll wrap it up.
So there's a lot of stuff in here. I mirror what the other gentleman said about we need to define, especially things about close proximity and walking distance when we're talking about I guess I'll put a quote in here, because that one really, those are probably the two that affect me the most and that are most concerned to most of the people that I know. Where is it? Let's see, 7 point, wait a minute. Well, maybe someone can help me find it. It's the one about where they're setting the limits for close proximity or walking distance.
Yeah,
Which one is that?
I remember that one. I don't know, oh,
I think it's in the 8s.
Is it in the 8s?
urban
1.8.
design.
8.18? Oh, okay, here, page 10, I found it. So, Denny, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, but I think you can handle it. So, one of my concerns is about the idea of this vague definition of walking distance within frequent transit service, either existing or planned. Transit service could be planned years in advance, yet never built. We need to have more specificity on this distance. As Mr. Egner stated in one of your meetings, quote, we need to have more discussion about how do the corridors overlap around 32nd. 32nd is a frequent transit corridor, so-called, and if we talk about a quarter mile off of that, that's a really big swath that you could potentially have more intense development. That could be kind of controversial. I mean, when you're right on 32nd, that's one thing, but when you're a quarter mile off of it or an eighth of a mile off of it, you're smack in the middle of the neighborhood, so there's going to be some we need to still think about that, end quote. So I agree with that statement, and I encourage you guys to look through all this stuff, and I appreciate all your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dan Eisenbeis.
Good evening, Chair Travis, members of the commission. For the record, my name is Dan Eisenbeis. I live at 2415 Southeast Llewellyn Street in the historic Milwaukee neighborhood. Thank you for your service on this commission, and thank you for all the effort you're putting into this particular project. I also want to commend the work of staff thus far on this effort. It's been a lot of work. I served on the Comp Plan Advisory Committee, but my comments here this evening are just my individual comments. So I want to offer a couple general comments and a couple specific comments, and I'm sure that many of these are things that you've already given some thought to. But I think it's really important to keep in mind at the forefront that this is intended to be an update to a long-term document guiding the city's change over the next couple of decades. And in that respect, it's really important that the policies that are contained therein endure and have some durability. And I think there's a little bit of a tension in terms of not being overly prescriptive, but also making sure to not include language that is inherently subjective in many cases. So I think you have and will hear suggestions for including concepts like community character or style, things that may have value, but when it comes to translating that into code language, which will be a project that you'll be working on, it's something that is very much fraught and can lead to a lot of litigation and probably a lot of drawn out hearings that you all conduct on development applications. I also think on topics like defining walking distance, there's an opportunity to refine that in the code development process, and it doesn't need to happen in this document. I would agree with all of the comments that Celestina offered in terms of refining the references to equity and definition of equity, as well as establishment of a DEI committee, and including that as a policy in this document. Also want to say that, in my view, this is unfinished work even once it's adopted, until the city moves forward with updating its TSP, with updating the comp plan map, and revisiting the housing policies in light of implementation of state legislative mandates. And I know the intent is to do that, but I hope that not too much time elapses before that work begins. Lastly, I just want to call out one specific policy. I believe it's policy 7.3.8. It's in the sustainability section. It has to do with potential reduction of parking requirements for development in proximity to transit corridors. I hope that reduction includes the potential for elimination of parking requirements, if that makes sense, thinking 20 years out in certain instances. And if that needs to be explicit, I would encourage that. I would also encourage referencing existing or planned transit corridors so that that statement is more in line with some of the other policy statements in the document. Thank you for your consideration.
Any questions for Dan? Thank you. Stefan Lashbrook.
Thank you. Stefan Lashbrook, 4342 Southeast Rockwood Street. I'll start by saying I support the comments of Mr. Eisenbeis and Celestina DeMoro. I don't need to elaborate on that. I think I've given you written comments, and I'll try to abbreviate those as best I can here. And I need to start by saying that even though I've been active in the CPAC and I chair the Llewellyn Neighborhood Association, my comments are my own and don't represent those groups. And it gets really redundant, but I think a whole lot of thanks are in order for the staff and consultants on this document. It's really important, I think, that this document goes back to the vision process, and I think it does a really good job of carrying that forward. So that's just kind of like point number one. The second one, I'm really glad that it talks about neighborhood hubs in several different policies. And a lot of us may not know what those are going to look like, but we know that they're important, and they were certainly important to people in the vision process. One of my personal favorites, I want to point out policy 8.2.1 sub H, the reference to VUNRFs. It's about time we start talking about alternatives to regular full urban improvements for streets, and in my neighborhood, certainly that could have value. I'm supportive of the policy language on middle housing and on density increases. I know that some of those things will make your lives more miserable in the future as you deal with hearings, but I think that those are really important going forward. Another one of my favorite policies is 5.1.2, requiring developers to pay for studies that could be conducted by third parties. I've worked for a couple different cities that employed that kind of practice. It worked really well, and I would hope Milwaukee can make better use of those things for traffic studies, wetland delineations, scientific studies, any number of things like that. On the kind of the category of things I think could be improved in this document, I'd start by saying that urban renewal, I don't recall urban renewal even being mentioned in the document. I don't recall it really being much of a topic after the very earliest CPAC meetings, but I think that that we need a placeholder there because there's great opportunity for either expanding urban renewal areas or adding new ones at some point in the future. And as Dan said, it could be a long ways out there, but this is the time to put the policies in place. The references to tree canopy, I think, are really important, but I also think they require, I'm almost done, the right trees at the right places, and I think we need a policy commitment about removing invasive species. One of my favorites being English ivy, because we're spending all this time talking about adding trees to the mix out there, while English ivy is out there strangling trees in every neighborhood. And there seems to be no comprehensive approach to dealing with that. Finally, I think stronger wording. I know we'll get to it with the TSP in the future, but stronger language about transit service, where it's needed, and frequency of service. I think there's just kind of a general assumption that TriMet will deal with that, and you know, it'll happen when it happens. And from my experience working in the transit world, I can tell you it happens when people put pressure on the entities that provide transit service to make it happen. And I think some of that policy language could help provide some of that pressure. I'll stop there. My written comments kind of elaborate on what I've already said. I'd be glad to answer any questions I could.
I do. Mr. Lashbrook, I'm going to rely on your expertise, knowing that you are a former Lake Oswego planner, right, or work for the city of Lake Oswego in a high capacity, and that you have worked with our city, and not only as a volunteer, but as an interim person, and knowing the great work that you have done with the Leadership Academy and working with people to help try to understand how the city works. So what I am grappling with is, how does diversity, inclusion, and equity committee interact with land use or making suggestions for land use?
I'll go back to Celestina's comments. I agree with what she said. I guess I'll point out that even though I'm a perfectly old white guy, I come from a very diverse family. My extended family is mixed racial, mixed ethnic, and mixed religious. So a lot of that stuff I take pretty personally. I think that well, there's been some really scholarly work done in the last couple of years about how this country, both at the national level and state and local level, institutionalized segregation in housing. And I think, and frankly, early in my planning career, I was clearly part of that and had no clue that that's what it was doing, the standard code type things that we had in place and used for years. I think moving in the opposite direction from that, creating a committee like that could help. And certainly having some other eyes looking on policy proposals especially, but land use proposals too, about does this somehow constitute segregation? And is there something else we could do to prevent it? I think that's...
So would that be the major role of the diversity, inclusion, and equity committee? Is that to review policies if they are fair, or is it to try to get inclusion of other groups involved in the city?
I don't think we know yet, because, you know, I don't know how that group might be constituted, what kind of bylaws it might have. So I think we're kind of guessing, looking forward to how it might operate.
Would you be afraid if we put it in a land use policy that you would be restricted to actually having to review land use policies?
Would I oppose it if that committee were created and then told they could only look at land use? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I guess, or you would be committed to it.
No, I wouldn't be opposed to that, but I also would not want to narrow the scope of what they might do and what recommendations they might make.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Oh, I've got to say, too,
No, for you.
you've got so much hard work ahead of you on this. I'll thank you in advance.
Well, we're gonna invite you to come to hearings as we are adopting codes, so don't think you're out of this yet.
I think I'll be there.
Chair Travis, all of our guests have had really good comments, and they haven't been able to fit them in 3 minutes. And so I propose that we increase the time limit to 5 or 6 minutes so that we're not arbitrarily treating certain folks who are more comfortable going over the limit differently than folks who stick to their limit.
Okay. Yeah, I was keeping it loose, but I will, how about we do 5 minutes then?
Okay.
Because I think that's been kind of monitoring, and people have been getting another 60 seconds to a minute and a half. So.
That sounds right.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Okay, Neil Schulman.
Hello, I'm Neil Schulman. I'm the Executive Director of the North Clackamas Watersheds Council. Our office is up on 2416 Southeast Lake Road. And I wanted just to really present kind of the council's take on this plan thus far. And in our opinion, so just let me back up for a moment. The Watershed Council is a multi-stakeholder group that is a 501c3 nonprofit that works to restore watershed health to the creeks in our section of North Clackamas County, which includes the Kellogg-Mount Scott watershed. And our take on this plan is that it will really be the single largest determining document that will determine in the next 20 years to what extent the city of Milwaukee will be likely to have healthy streams and healthy fish and wildlife populations and healthy tree canopy in 20 years. And we think it goes a long way to that. There are several things about it that the council is quite pleased with, and some things about it that we think should be strengthened. And we submitted some detailed comments that staff has kind of plowed through and adopted some of, and I think some others are probably hopefully going to find homes in the codes and ordinances that follow, but I wanted to hit on a couple of high-level things, if I might. The first one is we strongly agree with the addition of language that the city needs to not only maintain its existing natural areas, but add to them. We obviously are going to be seeing population growth. That means those natural areas that we have now are going to be more heavily impacted by people, and to sustain wildlife populations, we need more. And the other thing that we did find was missing from the policies that we feel is important is that the natural areas should be planned with connectivity in mind. Small isolated parcels generally don't sustain fish and wildlife populations, and that concept has been really at the heart of natural areas planning in the region since the early 1990s, and we think it needs a place in here. This has been our number one project for some time now. We strongly support the partnership with the city in planning for the restoration of Kellogg Creek to a free-flowing creek with improved salmon habitat, improved water quality, more floodplain storage, finding a way to not bottle up the creek behind an impassable dam that dates back to Abraham Lincoln's youth. And we look forward to working on that more. We strongly support the conservation values and the overlay zones of the Willamette Greenway, the HCAs and WQRs. Those are core and should be maintained. And we also appreciate the recognition in this plan that when you talk about really stream health, you're actually really talking about what happens in the uplands, not just right next to the creek. Land use and impervious surface in the upper parts of the watershed where you're nowhere near water is actually what causes the biggest amount of creek damage, stormwater, changes in flow, changes in creek in stream structure, and that has to be addressed. And this plan does acknowledge that, but acknowledging it is unfortunately the easy part. The Clackamas Partnership did a big strategic plan in 2018, and they looked at the Kellogg-Mount Scott watershed. Watersheds, when they get to about 45% impervious surface throughout the whole basin, become really, really hard to recover effectively. And Kellogg-Mount Scott is hovering right around that level. It was within the margin. So we have a pretty short window of time to which we need to not only not add more impervious surface, but we need to hopefully get rid of some. And there's plenty of examples of how to do that, but it takes incentives for replacing old pavement with pervious pavement, incorporating bioswales more and more into the planning structure. One of the comments that we made kind of coming out of what we consider a very successful partnership with Bonaventure Senior Living on Rusk Road was that there are some advantages to us being able to interact with proposed developments early in the process before they get too deep into a design, so that hopefully we can work with them, and so can some of the other experts on green design, and kind of help them do that earlier rather than later. But there are definitely going to be programmatic needs that I think we are going to look forward to working with the city on to address that impervious surface. That's the single biggest threat to our watersheds. We also support the climate preparedness portion of the plan, and obviously that is forward-looking and appropriately so. We are already seeing shifts in weather patterns. I had a conversation with a fish biologist yesterday about the repeated patterns of fall rain starting a little bit later every year and the impact that has on coho salmon. But really what we feel, the one thing that we do feel does also need to be addressed in here somewhere is the issue of late season water availability. As we have drier and drier summers, finding ways to keep water in the creek is an important thing for water quality. It's an important thing for fish habitat. It is, there's a lot of different ways of doing it, and there was one of the staff comments was, hey, we don't need to figure out exactly how to do this in this document. We can do that later, but I think it is important that we figure out how to do it somehow. But the biggest thing I really wanted to hit on briefly is the issue of that somebody else mentioned, which is the importance of tree canopy. And we really strongly support what some consider to be an ambitious goal of 40% canopy, and that should be a top priority. I think a colleague of mine who works for the city of Portland was on the radio recently saying, hey, we have this wonderful piece of technology now that absorbs stormwater, cools the air, reduces rates of childhood asthma, increases property values, and provides wildlife habitat. Oh, and it's called a tree. One of the biggest things we can do is preserve the trees that we have already. And we know that we can't get to 40% strictly by a tree ordinance that only covers public property. We know it's going to need to be broader than that, and we support that. Our council spends countless hours and thousands of dollars planting trees that are about this big when we put them in the ground, and that is great, and we'll obviously continue to do that. But ultimately, preserving the trees that we already have, that are already full size, that are already providing all of those benefits, is probably one of the most important things we can do. The other listening to the conversation about the equity component of this plan that folks mentioned earlier, and this is not my area of strong expertise, but it is also one of the areas that is that you often see not being delivered equitably. You see lots of trees in the upscale neighborhoods and not a lot in lower income neighborhoods, and those have very negative impact, and the lack of trees has negative impacts on both property values and human health as well as the environmental benefits. Those are kind of our high-level comments on this plan. Again, we feel like there are a lot of things that are really moving us forward quite well, and some things that we think just need to be strengthened either in this phase or depending on the level of detail in the codes and ordinances and maps to come, and we look forward to being part of that process. Thank you.
Any questions?
I have a question. Interesting testimony. When you mentioned the upstream issues of permeability, I asked myself, what can the city of Milwaukee do to influence those who have much more control of the upstream permeability? I mean, I don't know how you make that jump across those boundaries.
Well, as you are probably well aware, because Jerry was in the meeting at our office about it, the WES is currently redoing their stormwater standards, and those stormwater standards will cover all of WES's territory, and because WES provides the stormwater for Happy Valley, which contains the headwaters of Kellogg Mount Scott Creek, it is of obvious interest to the city, and I don't know if the city has commented on those proposed policies. Like this plan, their standards are currently at kind of the high policy level, but not at the code level yet. But I would encourage the city in some form, if it has not already, to comment on those as a downstream stakeholder, basically. The other thing that is that WES, along with a couple of other stormwater agencies, and this gets a little bit to the climate and late water availability, are doing some modeling for how they think climate change will affect the both drinking water availability and stormwater availability across multiple jurisdictions. And I believe the jurisdictions they're doing it with are, of course, the City of Portland, WES, and Clean Water Services. But I've shared with Natalie Rogers that this is going on. I think she is hopefully connecting with that because obviously, again, it's going to be of equal interest, if not greater, to the city of Milwaukee, what that modeling shows is likely to happen. The third effort that we hope to have some information on by the fall is we are working with the Wetlands Conservancy and the Institute for Natural Resources to actually do some mapping of the wetlands in the Kellogg Mount Scott drainage and looking at their each wetland's water budget and how that affects downstream flooding, and looking where there's an opportunity to add water storage. And we may, if this project works the way we think it's going to work, hopefully by sometime this fall or next winter, we will have basically a spatial assessment of that, and we'll be able to say, hey, if you really want to reduce downstream flooding in this area, this is the wetland you should enhance or add storage capacity to, or do something like that. So it's a long-winded answer to a fairly simple question. Sorry.
It's a complicated question in just a few words. Thank you for that.
Sure. I had a question as well. You mentioned in your testimony today the notion of a threshold for impervious area coverage or effective impervious area coverage that would allow a watershed to be healthy. I didn't see that comment reflected in the written testimony from the North Clackamas Watershed Council, and I wonder if you would if you would recommend a new policy or addition to one of the established policies, something about establishing impervious threshold targets.
Would certainly be good to set targets, and I think the challenge behind setting those targets is obvious. There's two things about that, and one of them is, as he mentioned, the basin, the watershed does not follow city boundaries, so the city of Milwaukee could set a target, but what happens when you cross that boundary, especially when the headwaters are outside of the city boundaries. But that being said, there is definitely a lot of value to having a clearer goal than less. And I can certainly be happy to share with folks, and I've shared with Commissioner Edge as well, some of the literature that just says, hey, this is the point at which you start to see stream channels start to change. This is the point where it really becomes hard to recover, et cetera. But yeah, the challenge would just be, what's the goal within the city of Milwaukee, knowing that doesn't necessarily mean anything happens outside the city limits. It would still be an improvement. And I also think that where the city of Milwaukee leads, in my experience with the council, a lot of eventually other jurisdictions may follow.
Yeah, so given the flexibility that a legislative hearing provides us as opposed to a quasi-judicial, I think I'll just go out on a limb and invite through the next public comment period, you to provide a recommendation for a policy, either an adaptation of an existing policy or a new one around establishing a target for impervious area thresholds. I think you'd be better positioned to help craft that language than the commission might be, but it's something I would like to have the opportunity to deliberate on. And then I had another question around including, along those lines, including water quantity. And I think you had various comments that were reflected in the staff matrix. And the staff response was that North Clackamas Watershed Council, this is your comment on the overarching chapter goal for Goal 3. Your comment was, we support the goal largely as written. However, it should include water quantity as well as water quality in the goal statement. And staff's response was, yes, North Clackamas Watershed Council recommended adding water quantity to the overarching chapter goal in Goal 3.2. Staff is not opposed, but would recommend edits to the language of Goal 3.2 if Planning Commission believes that this change is needed. And so I would just want to encourage developing a response to staff's recommendation there, so that there's something that maybe the Watershed Council and staff could agree would be a recommendation to council to the commission to include.
Work with David and Denny on that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bill Corti. And just to clarify, we gave Neil 10 minutes since he's representing a group, since Commissioner Burns is helping keep us on track here and keep us in line. So for the record, please state your name and address, and if you're representing yourself or an organization, so that we can add the appropriate amount of time for your testimony.
My name is Bill Cordy, and I live at 3963 Southeast Lake Road, and I'm representing myself. And my public comments are on Addendum 1 on the first page there. So I'm one of the owners of property on Monroe Street, and we have 3 rental houses on one side that take up 1 acre, and then on the other side we have an office building, and I provided maps to show you where they are. I would like the Planning Commission to consider rezoning this area now that you've finished the comprehensive plan review to change it to a higher density. Right now it's zoned R1B, and it's only possible to put 32 units onto 1 acre site, and those 3 houses take up 1 acre. I would like to have it changed to a downtown mixed-use zoning, similar to what's in the downtown area. And then on the other side of the street, we have the office building, and that also is zoned R1B, and that is a little less than 1 acre because TriMet bought some of our land when they put in the light rail line. The reason why I'm doing this, why I would like to have this done, is because I believe we need to get more people onto the light rail line, and because of its close proximity to the light rail station, I believe it needs to go to a higher density. There are times when I'm working at the properties there, and I'm seeing light rail cars going by, and there may be maybe 10 or 12 people on it. It's busy and packed during the rush hours, but during the daytime, it's on those other hours, it's not being used much. And if you rezone it to a higher density, we'd be able to get more people into the downtown businesses, and they'd be more profitable. And we also need to get people out of their cars and onto that light rail line because of global warming. I'm tired of driving in Portland and being stuck with the traffic going so slow. These properties that I have, 1 acre on one side and 1 acre on the other side, there's ample area that you can put underground parking, which is needed for a higher density. Also, something else, when TriMet put the light rail line in, they put a 10-foot wide easement along the retaining wall or fencing, and I'd like to see that eventually turned into a bike path and a walkway, so that people that want to go to the light rail station can easily go from whatever they put on my properties, apartments or whatever. They can easily go over and get over to that light rail station by walking on that bike path or walkway, whichever is added, or whichever is put in. as far as when the properties that I have are sold, we have no idea when we're going to be selling them. It could be a year, it could be 10 years, but I'd like to plan ahead now for that, to get a higher density in there now. The other thing is that I also looked at other properties on the east side of the light rail tracks to see if some of those should be rezoned and get more people into the light rail line. And I found 6 other properties there, and they're in the packet here that I've given. One is the Amato building next to the light rail tracks on Washington Street, and then there are 4 others on Southeast 23rd Avenue. These are all zoned R1B. I would like you to consider rezoning those also to the downtown mixed-use density. And I think that is about it for me.
Any questions?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Elvis Clark.
Good evening. Elvis Clark, Ardenwell neighborhood, 3536 Southeast Sherry Lane. And good evening, commissioners.
Are you representing comments from the neighborhood or from yourself?
No, I'll be doing my individual. Although I'm active in the neighborhood, I don't know. I haven't. We only meet once a month, so you can't really get things coordinated. But anyways, my main concern about this comp plan draft is that the interchange between walkability and density, because I present a written testimony, and I provided a picture of one of the roads in our neighborhood that's pretty typical of some of our neighborhoods that are within walking distance to the transit. But if you look at them, there's no sidewalk, and they're rutted and potted, and you can turn your ankle pretty easily on some of these things. So I don't think it's an adequate metric at this point to say just that you're within walking distance to change the land use density in a rezoning. The problem I see in doing the transportation after you do the draft plan is that when you get to figuring out how much it's going to cost and how much time is involved in getting streets safe that are within walking distance of transit, the temptation by the city is going to be to back away and just allow the density and not actually follow through with improvements to that street. So I think that the draft plan needs to have some kind of a commitment by the city to upgrade the streets that are within walking distance of transit before they allow a rezoning and a higher density. That's my major concern about this thing. Anyways, that's it.
That's it. Any questions?
I was reading Mr. Clark's testimony earlier today, and so this idea popped up to my mind, and this may be directed more towards city staff, but I want you to stay here. If development happens on let's say, I don't want to call it an unimproved road, but one of the many roads that Mr. Clark is talking about, what is the obligation of the developer or the person that's doing that to make actual road improvements? I know that there's frontage improvements that they have to make, put in a sidewalk, do an apron to their, but can you make them required to go out halfway out into the street and improve the road? Or if they make a connection, if they tear up the street, they have to replace it? What is the rule on that?
Well, it depends. That's the answer. For property that is zoned for a particular type of development, there is, we have, and if there is an impact that is associated with the development. So if it's a fair amount of improvement, we would have someone do a traffic impact study that would then determine what type of improvements are needed, or if there are so many impacts on that street that they need to do something. Typically, what we need to find that there is a nexus between the development itself and the road, what the impact is on the road, and then there needs to be an improvement that is roughly proportional to the impact. So all of this is driven by a number of court cases, and it's a complicated type of process that we go through. That's different than the upzoning question that Mr. Clark is describing, where you could, in fact, make decisions about whether to upzone property as to whether or not there's a commitment to a certain level of improvement that might occur. I don't know. Do you want to chime in, Justin or David?
But it doesn't sound like a townhouse or a fourplex or a cottage cluster is going to create a demand on the system that is going to make a major road improvement.
No, that is absolutely true. It's going to be generally frontage improvements that they're going to be required to address. It's not going to be the connection off-site in most cases.
If I could add, in those cases, especially where you're adding a number of units but not upzoning the property, you'd be relying more on some of the transportation system development charges, some of the other fees that are, implemented by the city that would, some of the programs that, the engineering department and the finance department have, those would factor into some of that, but they probably wouldn't pay for the entirety of the improvements.
If you recall the development that was proposed on just off of King Road on 43rd, where we were proposing to provide a connection to, God, what was the name of that street?
White Lake?
Yeah, no, Whitetail or whatever it was.
Exactly, that area. That was one of these issues. Did the improvement that we were originally requesting cause enough of an impact? Was there a connection between what the initial request for a street improvement and the amount of trips that would be generated by that development? It's just it's complicated. And where we ended up is we thought that what could be roughly proportional there is the dedication of land for a street, but not the cost of the improvement of a street. So each case is dealt with separately, and you have to make findings case by case. But again, in a zone change, I think it's a little bit different because you've got to you can look beyond the site a little bit when looking at a zone change in terms of how you're going to pay for those improvements. But again, the zone change isn't development. It's
right. So let me, Mr. Clark, if I'm misinterpreting your statement, please let me know.
Yeah.
Basically, it sounds like to me that he's tying in density with CIP projects, right, capital improvement projects. So is that a manageable way to tie together those two, land use and capital improvement projects? And is it loggable or keep-upable, or like if you improve a street, you can allow more density?
I think that may be true. I'm going to let Justin chime in.
Well, I guess from a standpoint of land use, is it manageable? I mean, can the city actually manage a system like that?
I don't know the answer to that question. I wish somebody from engineering was here specifically, but one there are a lot of considerations that go into determining where we do a capital improvement project.
Right.
And those might not be triggered by density because we may have interests otherwise that need to take city dollars for the capital improvement
Correct,
project.
but you could do it the other way. If a street is improved, then you automatically give it a little bit more density.
I don't know that you would link it so closely. I think most of the capital improvement projects are tied, because of limited dollars, are tied to more of your busier streets, where I think Mr. Clark's comment is the side streets, and a determination that maybe, this may be where you're thinking, is a determination that within a quarter mile of a transit corridor, you're going to increase density. And Mr. Clark's fear is that those side streets can't handle the pedestrian traffic or some of the assumptions under.
Correct. So then my idea would be, well, if you tie it in with capital improvement, no matter where those capital improvements are, if they end up being within a quarter mile of a transit zone, then you could automatically increase the density. But is that a manageable
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, do you get the only time that the rezone becomes effective is when you've got that pedestrian improvement.
Right, or you got a capital improvement project that's on the books that's, let's say, within 10 years or however you want to say it.
I mean, I think there's a way, I think you could make those types of triggers in your code.
But so this would be a code, not necessarily, I mean, you would need a policy to support the development of the code.
Right.
So.
I would also like to add that Commissioner Beatty had mentioned about being more incremental in our upzoning or zoning for more density, and this might be one way, this latter approach to being more incremental in bringing in more density, and then you can experience how it really plays out in the real world as you are more incremental rather than being more wide spread. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting. Okay. Ronell Coburn and...
It's just seated minutes. And
seated
I'm representing a group, I realized anyway, then I cut it down to
okay, come on in.
as short as possible. Okay. I know everybody gets tired out. Yeah. My name is Ronell Coburn. I live in the Ardenwald neighborhood on Southeast 29th between Malcolm and Boyd. And even though we're hours into this now, I want to say Happy New Year, everyone. I did think of everybody here over the holidays when I was pooped out trying to get some rest, and hope that you all got a little bit of a break too. So here we are, starting the year in the midst of a multitude of changes and the monumental efforts they require. And everybody, all of you have been going hard for a long time, and I want to acknowledge that I see that. Mayor Gamba stated in the November Milwaukee pilot that change can be scary, but things are changing whether we like it or not, and reiterated this sentiment in a November council meeting. I think most of us in this room are here because we're interested in change and being a part of it, and we don't find it scary, but find it exciting. And I find a lot of my neighbors, and talking to them, are actually excited about changes too, rather than frightened of them. They just want and need information and easy access to it. As all of you know, community engagement is my ballywick, I guess you could say. And everyone here is just so interested in shaping change. I'm really heartened to be in this room starting this year, in a room full of people who are change makers, who've chosen to commit so much of their life's energy to steering and rowing the good ship Milwaukee. And again, wish to really start 2020 off by saying this. I'm also very heartened by numerous changes that are being made to community engagement since I got involved at the end of August. And I made a list of them because I wanted to acknowledge them, but I will email them by various people in the staff and on commissions and committees and things. It's a whole paragraph. So I want you all to know that I appreciate what's happening. It is very much a time of updating and improvement, and again, so much has been done. The beautiful library, Cronenberg Park, the South Downtown Plaza, Plaza. I'm tired too. And so much more is on deck that really substantially impacts quality of life for every single citizen in our city. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work to make progress specifically on public engagement and inclusion this year, so more citizens can more easily get informed, get educated, and take part in shaping the change that affects all of our daily lives. On December 17th, the Planning Commission presented their annual review to the City Council. At this time, Commissioner Edge mentioned that the Planning Commission informed the CPAC that the Commission did not want to act as the Community Involvement Action Committee due to a lack of resources to take on this work and be effective at it. Specifically, Commissioner Edge mentioned a lack of 3 vital resources: that of time, interest, which he called passion, but 3-letter acronyms, because here comes expertise, TIE, something that I could remember in my mind. So due to a lack of the resources of time, interest, and expertise, he said that the Planning Commission had told CPAC that they really didn't want to take on that role because it's not what you guys do. You don't have degrees in public communications and marketing and digital marketing and advertising and all of that stuff. In regards particularly to interest and expertise in public communications, he stated that he thought that these functions of the community involvement should be delegated to those who both have a passion for it and expertise in the relevant practices, particularly that of digital communications, because that's how things get conveyed these days. I'm here because I've been very involved, again, particularly with the Block 1 community involvement of reviewing the comp plan. And I had an idea that if the absence of a true CIAC committee that's composed of community members and relative staff, I had the idea to propose at least a community involvement subcommittee to the Planning Commission to assist and guide it in its role as the CIAC, since the Commission itself lacks the fundamental resources required to run effective community involvement programs, which really isn't your fault. It's not your expertise. And the community has citizens who are willing and able to serve in this role. A group that meets monthly, there was something said in a council meeting where there was an assumption of meeting twice a year, almost done, very close. A group that meets monthly to formulate criteria for engagement that utilizes already existing community resources and existing city digital infrastructure could be an excellent interim solution while more comprehensive, effective community engagement systems are developed that were part of the list, Kelly Brooks and the IAP2 and all of that. So thank you all for all your hard work and efforts, and here we go into what promises to be a very full year of changes for Milwaukee that are nothing for anyone to be afraid of, but instead are exciting and full of potential. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
I did have a question. We heard some of our early testimony from CPAC members about the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and I wonder if you had any thoughts on how a CCI committee might differ or be similar to a potential DEI committee.
It would very much differ. So when I think of community involvement and you read the OAR, the Oregon stuff. I don't have the numbers memorized, but you know what I'm talking about, those first set of things. They talk about things like, they even address things like, what's the content of communications? Right? What makes a good communication? So sending a notice out that a meeting's happening, that's nice, but all it does is inform people that there's some meeting by some name and a date. It doesn't say what the meeting's about, why it should be of interest to the people receiving the communication. So, for example, I was thrilled that a postcard came out to every house about the comp plan hearings, right? Fantastic, thrilled. But that doesn't do anything to educate people. And over the last couple of years, to educate the community, a larger number of the community, about what a comp plan is, how it affects them, why they should be interested. So yes, maybe there's overlap, but somebody who has digital marketing expertise and knows how to run Facebook boosted posts to get people out to meetings, that's kind of a different thing than what I think I'm hearing a DEI is about, right? It's about public communications expertise. I'm self-employed and very much a public communicator, successful for 21 years, so I know what the criteria are for what is successful. The number of people in this room is a direct measurement of the success /failure /effectiveness of public outreach measures. We have 21,500 people. What percentage of people should be in this room because of that number, right? Direct mailing, does anybody here know what a good return is on a direct mailing, percentage-wise? 2%. I don't expect that you would. 1 to 3%. So then you could take 21,500, multiply it times that. That's the number of people who should be in the room here as a direct, hard measurement of effective community outreach. Maybe a little different than DEI, right? And they're being a captain of the ship for the city who knows how to do this stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ben Rousseau, last one. Get to wrap us up, Ben. Applause.
Big hitter. Hello, can you hear me? Thank you all. My name is Ben Rousseau. I am on 3264 Southeast Lake Road in the Lake Road neighborhood. I have been a member of the Comp Plan Advisory Committee and the Vision Advisory Committee, but I'm not here representing either of those. Vision Advisory Committee is no longer. But I am here just to add my testimony in support of the changes that I had sent in. I also want to thank you all for your contributions to this process already and what you have coming ahead of you. Thanks staff and our dedicated consultants in the process leading up to this point. So basically, I think my fellow committee members stated mostly what I wanted to share there. I just wanted to kind of bring the piece that maybe I have that they didn't, and that was being involved with the Vision Advisory Committee process and how much that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion came out in that process. We had a number of town halls, and I was involved with facilitating discussion on many of those, and it was that was something that came to the top. We had a lot of robust conversation about, and that's why that that action item ended up in the vision plan. And on that vision plan, it actually calls out specifically to implement it via the comp plan process. And the reason why I would really highly advise that we do move forward with it during this process is we don't really have any mechanism in place to make sure that any of those other no public process going forward to make sure that the other items on that vision plan are actually implemented. We have in our the very first line in our vision is that the city is entirely equitable. I think that wasn't just put there randomly. That was put there because of all that community input. So I think it is a top priority for the city. The other piece related to that is we stepped into the housing block with really solid background learning on the history of racism, structural racism, institutional racism within state, local, and federal policy. And it exists right here in Milwaukee. Councilor Falconer read her own deed, I believe it was, at the kickoff housing forum, stating that no person other than those of the white race shall live in or own that piece of property that she lives in. This is real. This is something that has really drastically impacted the residents of our city up to this point, and it's something that we started into the process with a really deep intention to try to correct that. If we don't set up some sort of structure to ensure that that actually happens, that our policies moving forward actually are moving things in a positive direction, then we can definitely expect that we are going to continue that. Just like I work up in North Portland, right, and I go by Williams and Vancouver in that area often, and the shifts that have happened with development up in that area and the displacement of communities has been really horrific. That was some of our background reading had to do with that in this process. There are neighborhoods where members of certain churches, they send out buses every weekend to go pick up the parishioners to bring them to church every weekend because their communities are that much torn apart. So we don't, I mean, that stuff, like the communities that we do have that will likely not be benefiting from some of the development that's to come, we need to be watching out for that, and I think the standing committee is really the only way to do that.
Any questions for Ben? No?
Good. Okay. End it with that then.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Wow. That's good stuff. Thank you, everybody. That was really incredible information and feedback that you provided to us this evening. I'm going to go back to my script here and make sure we're on track. So from here, I think as we mentioned at the beginning of this, we have another hearing, and so folks that weren't able to come tonight, hopefully have that on their calendar to come, and so we'll be receiving additional comments and additional written comments, and there's been some follow-up that items that already came through in this exchange tonight that we'll be able to hear back on. So in terms of the Planning Commission talking through some of this tonight, I think the idea is that we can continue to get some clarity from staff around key issues, maybe that we've heard, things that we want them to bring back to us at the next hearing. And we want to make sure that we have time for Commissioner Edge to weigh in on some things that we know are very important to him as well. So given that, I'm thinking, if we can have, open this discussion up at this time, but not belabor certain topics, but rather just kind of get some ideas and general responses out tonight, maybe in the next 30 minutes or so. And then staff can come back and we can, we'll have time for additional hearing, and hopefully Commissioner Edge will be well to participate as well. But does that sound?
And maybe I can describe kind of what the next steps are that we've been thinking about. And I know the commission in our joint meeting with the council in December talked about kind of the next steps a little bit, but not everybody in the audience may have heard that. Right now, staff is working on a work program to figure out how to move forward with the housing code and map amendments that would come out of these policies. And those would also consider the changes at the state level too. The House Bill 2001 requirements. Parallel to that, one of the things we're going to be moving forward is consideration of tree protection, so that we're not doing housing in as having that isolated from trying to address some of these environmental protections and tree protection. And there's an awareness in this process of sort of the elephant in the room that is parking, and how do we deal with that? So those are sort of three parts of this discussion that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be forming what we've called the CPIC, the Plan Implementation Committee. We've got an application form that is active on the city website right now for that, and we've got some candidates that have submitted. We've also got a separate application form for CPAC members. The way we've envisioned this committee is 6 members that might come from CPAC, 6 members from the broader public, and then having some rotating subject area experts that would come and sit with that committee. 1 planning commissioner, so you guys need to decide who might be the best planning commissioner in that role, and 1 city council member. And so that's how that's been discussed and kind of envisioned right now. We haven't advertised broadly the application form to members that have been involved in the planning process, because we are like a day or 2 away from having it converted into an online application where one can hit the submit button after typing in their information. And right now, if you were to go online and apply, you've got to fill out a PDF form and then copy it and send it in by email. So once we have that online form ready to go, we were going to do a broader notice out to everybody that's been involved in the comp plan process. So what is the CPIC will be about I'm thinking 18-month process or commitment to try to deal with not only housing, but also some of the other issues, the issues about Willamette Greenway amendments, the trying to take parks and schools and create a institutional zone. But the first priority, and this was a priority that Council and Planning Commission agreed on, was to deal with the housing element and try to figure out how we're going to implement all of that. And it will involve additional outreach, open houses, other types of work. And I think that it's going to take a couple of steps, like a concept development step that we will go out to the public and talk about what are the different ways in which you might approach this, and then drafting code after that. But we won't start with code. We'll start with different approaches. The form-based question is maybe the biggest one. How much of a form-based system do we want to employ versus some hybrid of form and traditional zoning? So none of that's decided at this point. It's just we want to talk about what the options are. So
the work that you started out with here, Denny, about the staff work on housing code and map amendments and the impact of implementing state policy, that will go to CPIC, or that will come here?
No, it will go to CPIC first, okay, and then to Planning Commission. But we will be, talking with planning, much like we've done with the comp plan policy work. We've kept Planning Commission in the loop all the way. We'll do the same thing with the code work. Now, let me back up 1 second. For the way we're thinking about this is the CPIC will deal with the concept level work. It'll deal with the ways to get the stuff done and the way and code concepts, not necessarily code language. I don't expect CPIC to be wordsmithing. I expect them to pick among 3 different choices of approaches. So it'll be Planning Commission that hammers out the code language.
We get the fun stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. No, anyone questions for Denny about that? That's good information.
Yeah, I've got a question. Why do you think we have to have this interim step before we start writing code?
There's a lot of community interest in this. I think it needs to be, and there's still a lot of options about how you might implement some of these things. And we're not going to know what what's actually required from House Bill 2001 until probably September. We'll have a pretty good idea in a few months, but the rules aren't supposed to be adopted until September.
And I also think, Commissioner Massey, that this addresses the issue that you were saying, we should have a subcommittee to kind of work all this stuff out. I think that's kind of it.
Well, yeah, I did, but I didn't, I saw those subcommittees being, part of the Planning Commission.
Well, we think it's still a lot of work.
These are all questions. These are all questions because I guess I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the interim step, or I didn't grasp the interim step.
It's not. I mean, I'm hoping that the housing work would be done by September. I mean, that we're going to have a really good foundation and hopefully be ready to start hearings.
Well, again, my questions are just questions. I want to do it right, but at the same time, I want to do it as expeditiously as possible. So.
Yeah, well, even if we jump, I just think it's premature to just jump right into the code work right now.
Okay.
There's too many unknowns. And
especially on the housing piece.
Yeah, and it's really complicated.
Some of these other.
As we've looked at the map itself, I mean, there's questions about whether we use the same structure of the current comp plan has the low, medium, moderate, high densities. Is that appropriate to continue that structure? I mean, I think where we've been thinking is we ought to just go like a high, medium, low. What zones then fit those? Do we have the right zones? Do we really have a need for an R2.5 zone? I mean, there's questions like that I think we want to. Our goal would be to have a somewhat simpler system in the end. We think it's a little bit complicated right now and convoluted. There are also some map conflicts out there that we need to sort out. There's places that are plan designated differently than the zone. And those are some things we need to figure out which way does it go? Does it? So.
Okay. Key things that we want to make sure staff and our guests are aware of, things that we're thinking about at this point, feedback, things, observations, questions.
Chair, I have the nitpicky part for Mary. Do you want me to go through that real quick? It won't take me very long.
About like design and?
Well, no. Just a few things that need to be corrected in there that is kind of a little bit of wordsmithing, but there's some key concepts in here that they also need to think about. And I only went through I apologize, I only went through about half the document, so, but it's stuff like this, like on page, so I'm going to use the 5.1 page numbers. Do you understand when I say that? So on page 39, if we could put citing into the glossary, because you get it when you get later on in the document, but it doesn't make any sense at that R3B. And then on page 50, where you have the phrase says equity deals. To me, deals is a negative connotation of a word. It means that you have a problem that you have to deal with. So a much better verb there, I think, plays out a little bit better?
You know, I'm not sure that we want to go through all this tonight, especially if you've only gone through half the document. I think maybe
I will reflect my comments into an email.
if we can save that and streamline
But may I bring up one big point? In the Willamette Greenway, you say that you're no longer going to have master plans for parks, but yet every other policy that talks about a park says that we're going to work off the master plan. So there is a huge conflict there that you guys need to kind of sort out and work out that correctly.
That's bigger than nitpicky, so that I like that one. Not that I didn't like the other ones, but I just think in the interest of time and you know, I think I'd like to be able to share some of our initial, you know, content-wise or topic-specific things that we want staff to be able to react to.
Should we have our David bring back up the key issues slide?
And the key issues, yeah, can you do that?
Yeah, I can bring that up.
There are 4, as I recall.
So I'll start off with the discussion with the communication thing.
CIAC.
Yeah, and I think this ties in directly with this diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, so the state mandate says that we need a communication team that talks about land use only, correct?
Yeah, I mean, goal 1 is related to land use.
Land use only, all right. What I think happens is that we have community members that want to have groups that discuss these issues, but don't want to only be tied into land use. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that the worthy of both of these committees is excellent, but it is really a city council decision because it involves staff time and money. Let's put it what it boils down to. The easy button is to put it, the communications, onto the planning commission because all we have to do is talk about land use. Okay, that's the easy button because it doesn't cost really any more money to do it. But if we really want a robust community involvement committee, it should not be us. It should be people in the community talking about how you get them involved with everything, special events, town halls that aren't related to land use, events at the, meetings and, becoming involved with the, utility commission or whatever it is. So I think the two get intermingled with each other fairly easily. I would think that if we put in the diversity, equity, and inclusion into the land use, I would expect them then to give recommendations on land use things. But what we've heard testimony from is that, well, it's just a concept. We don't know what we're going to be working on. Just like if we make the planning commission be the communication, our only responsibility is communication for land use and nothing else. Which if that's what the citizens want, then, and I don't think that's what the citizens want, but I think that's how they want to take it. My suggestion would be that if the planning commission is responsible for the communication, that it be a joint meeting with all of the neighborhood chairs. We already have that kind of set up, and because they're the ones that we already found out at our last meeting that, hey, they're not even getting the information in time to be able to present to their NDA. I mean, that's one of the major communication problems that we have. So it seems to be that needs to be the hash out.
Is it possible to have a designated subcommittee of the Planning Commission that would consist of the NDA chairs or appointed representatives that would help with this role or help with the implementation?
A subcommittee of the Planning Commission?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wouldn't technically be a subcommittee of the Planning Commission if it's
No planning committee.
not including Planning Commission. I mean, we'd have to think about the structure. I mean, we can look into some examples of the way that different cities can do it. I mean, I worked for the city of Beaverton before this, and there's a dedicated committee, the BCCI, Beaverton Committee for Community Involvement, that was developed partially for Goal 1, but also for large, more widespread issues related to community engagement. And when it came to things like comprehensive plan amendments, we were required to go to them, but they didn't really drive our process. And so I think it's trying to find the happy medium as far as how to make sure that it's a group or a body, a committee that actually, serves the purpose that it's intended to. That it's just not to check off and to meet the OAR and, the statewide planning goals. But we can look into that. But yeah, I don't think it would technically be a subcommittee. I mean, just because it would be different representatives.
I guess,
part of the question was staffing and additional meetings, right?
Absolutely.
So that was one of the reasons I think we were interested in having the Planning Commission serve in that role. But you could still have it as an expanded Planning Commission, I mean, you could add people to a Planning Commission for that role. I mean, I think what part of this model is what happened in Lake Oswego and a number of other cities, McMinnville and others, had the Planning Commission in that role for a couple of meetings a year. They would meet as the CIAC for an hour, for 2 hours, and then meet as the Planning Commission. So it wasn't like extra meetings. It was just what hat are you wearing during that particular discussion, and that was the sort of convenience of having the Planning Commission serve that role. I think there's some interesting comments just about what's the expertise of the Planning Commission in evaluating that. But I mean, if you set that up, you're asking questions of either the public or the NDAs. What can we do to help you more? So you have that ability to get that input, I think.
Right, and I think that's where I think that piece about evaluating and measuring is really important and hasn't been done. And so, I guess my feeling at this time is about standing up another committee and putting it in a long-range document without, and then we're beholden to it, right? And not really knowing kind of like what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? Is that a good way to get to it? So, I mean, I'm inclined to kind of to have the Planning Commission serve in that way, but with expanded expertise and see, and then use that as a model to kind of like set some metrics and understand what we're trying to evaluate and, work with other groups a little more closely to before putting something into a long-range document without having it formed up and then we're beholden to it.
So, when we had this discussion with the city council, if I recall what the city council's said and concern is that they were inclined to want to use the Planning Commission as the CIAC, is that they had a existing body that they knew could address issues, okay? And since the CIAC requirement is primarily related to land use documents, there seemed to be a natural connection there. And there was concern about setting up a separate standalone committee from a blank sheet of paper because, there's going to be some spin-up time there to get organized and get something done. And so again, I don't want to speak for the, for the city council, but that's my recollection of what was portrayed in that meeting in December. I will tell you that, I have no problem with the Planning Commission taking on this role in some format. But one of the things I would caution against is I think that citizen involvement is much broader than land use, okay? And whether the CIAC stands on its own or as part of the Planning Commission, you just, once you've made that decision, that's not the end of it, okay? Because public safety and the budget and everything else needs citizen involvement. And so you just can't have this bolted-on solution. You've got to have built-in solutions to all of these content areas and that kind of thing. And that's my only caution, is that may require, some level of education training to make sure that these other areas have that citizen involvement. We have probably the greatest extent of citizen involvement because we're meeting here every couple of weeks with the citizens of the community. I don't know that level of engagement in the other content areas of the city, but I would encourage that to be happening as well. So I just don't think that this is just a land use issue.
Thank you.
But I caution against, I don't know that it's a standalone issue either. I'm a much bigger proponent of having a built-in solution in all these content areas because I think that they're just more effective that way. But it's more difficult because you're trying to do that in half a dozen content areas.
Yeah, if I could just respond, those are a lot of good comments. I think as far as it extending beyond land use issues, that's definitely true, and that's, I think, where we have to find the appropriate language and the appropriate role of the comprehensive plan, is that we're not trying to tackle things outside of land use. If there's a larger citywide, multidisciplinary, multi-topic solution that doesn't just deal with land use, that deals with events and all of these other things, then I think there's some direction that the Planning Commission can provide, but ultimately that's going to be a council decision because it impacts budget, it impacts staffing, all of that. I think as far as what we're proposing at this point, and Denny, as far as he had suggested that there might be kind of an extended Planning Commission specifically for those meetings. I think what we saw on December 10th with the NDA representatives that came, I thought that was an incredible meeting. I mean, it was a great discussion. We've talked about having that at least annually, but is there an opportunity to have it semi-annually or quarterly? It's obviously going to depend on the interest from the NDAs and from other groups as well, whether we expand that outside of NDAs or not, but that might be more appropriate to focus on the land use and transportation issues if we essentially expand one Planning Commission meeting per quarter or two per year to specifically be addressing these issues and to be focusing on the outreach as it relates to land use planning issues. And so I don't know if there's a way to revise the policy, to kind of call that out if there's a comfort level from the Planning Commission and wants to make that recommendation or at least consider it, and we can bring back some ideas at the next meeting as far as, well, what are some potential solutions to kind of utilize the Planning Commission and potentially supplement the Planning Commission.
David, is there a requirement that the comprehensive plan designate the CIAC via policy?
It doesn't specifically say that the comprehensive plan has to specify it. It says that you need to have one that deals with this. But, in most places, most comprehensive plans that I've seen, it essentially prescribes that role to someone.
To a specific committee.
Correct, yeah. And so, but different places do it in different ways. Denny's given some examples of places that don't have a dedicated standalone committee where the Planning Commission serves that role, and whether I haven't looked at their comp plans, so I don't know what the comp plans say, but I would assume their bylaws for the Planning Commission probably describe that role.
The separate bylaws. It was a separate committee.
Separate bylaws, yeah.
Denny, did Lake Oswego discuss anything beyond land use communication?
No, it was primarily focused on how well the planning projects did outreach. It was always about the outreach for planning projects.
So, I do see...
They would meet formally once a year to do that evaluation, but they would, actually, I think they'd meet more than once a year, depending on what...
Did the community engagement leader lead that meeting, or did the planning staff?
Lake Oswego was unique because you had a number of public involvement nerds on the Planning Commission. I mean, they loved, the one guy in particular just loved the topic. So he was a long-time planning commissioner, and he's sort of set the tone for even the members that followed, so it was and he would lead it. He was the chair, or he was a member, and he would kind of drive a lot of the discussion. But it was, you got to take it on.
Burns.
Yeah, I do see some overlap between a potential diversity, equity, and inclusion committee and a CIAC committee. We heard the recommendation from several folks on the CPAC to establish this DEI, and reading the staff key issues in detail here. I mean, prioritize the council goal 3 to prioritize ongoing community engagement efforts in Milwaukee, invest in further developing skills among staff for effective community engagement. Staff's response to the key issue 3 just has a lot of overlap in my mind with what a CIAC might do. So I wonder if we do, I don't want to try and advance, be too prescriptive in the comp plan with this concern about the blank slate and not knowing what it looks like. But do we decouple these issues and know that there are costs to committees and staff time and finding engaged community members to participate? And it just seems like, given the potential for a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee to define a charter and a process that covers some of the CCI or CIAC goals and get a twofer there. One way to handle that would be to change the policy in the comp plan to just say the city will establish designate a CIAC, but not state that it's the Planning Commission, and then have a separate process to evaluate what the DEI looks like and whether it could take on the CIAC role through their own charter, and that might be appropriately directed rather than by planning staff, but by the community involvement staff as the city's liaison. So that's the direction I would lean. I don't think this committee can do justice to the needs of the CIAC. The potential diversity, equity, and inclusion committee could have more focus and more time to really actualize what a CCI should be.
My sense in fewer words is maybe that the CIAC and the EDI or the DEI seem inherently like the values of each would link each other together fairly seamlessly. The two could be, but I tend to think that that's not the job of the Planning Commission, and I don't think that even an extension of the Planning Commission would serve what we're talking about to the fullest degree. I think it would be an underserved mission if we were to tackle it that way. I think the Planning Commission already has quite a full list of tasks ahead of us, and it seems even if the group were to meet annually or biannually or quarterly, it still doesn't seem, maybe that's not even necessarily enough. It always seems then you'd be talking retrospectively about the, things that had already happened, and you wouldn't be working in advance of a problem or trying to solve a problem as it's, coming to the group. So, I tend to think that it's not going to be well served by the Planning Commission to take on this 1 or 2 additional responsibilities.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And I mean, as far as Commissioner Burns' comment about being less prescriptive and having the comprehensive plan merely state that there will be a CIAC and not specifying what that is, we could look at the statutes and OAR and just see what how prescriptive we need to be. You know, if we are thinking about developing a standalone CIAC or a standalone DEI, or if it's somehow combined, I mean, that is a much larger discussion that we're going to need to get input from the council and from the city manager, to be honest. And, you know, they've expressed concerns. And ultimately, if it is a broader committee that deals with more than land use, it's not going to be housed within the planning department. It would be housed within the city manager's office. I mean, that's not, I'm not dictating that. I'm just saying it would be a much more natural fit. And then you would need to think about how you program that committee. Do you have a couple meetings per year that are focused on land use, and, you know, or do you tailor it to what's going on in the city? You know, and it's hard to say. So this is kind of a little bit of a moving target in that, you know, kind of the composition and the frequency of meetings are kind of dependent on what the role is and who serves that role. And so it's hard to say. So it might be that we want to be less specific within the policy language.
It's either that, or I think that everybody on the Planning Commission would be fine if the communications were limited to land use only, because that's something totally different than, but I think that we all feel, and I think we all understand, that the community wants something a lot bigger than just that. And so we could specify that our CIAC is only going to be talking about communications of land use, but we recommend that a larger body be created for outside of land use, which then can include the equity and stuff. Or, because I have a feeling in the last draft, right, or in the last comp plan, we were probably the CIC committee too, right? Is that correct?
I don't think it was named.
Oh, was never specified?
I don't think so.
I think we're really bad at holding special meetings.
I still think it should be a standalone body.
I agree. I think it should be too.
I mean, I think that's really the value of the NDA is how they've been they've advocated for their own areas and their own neighborhoods and matters that pertain to them, and it's been so valuable as input to the Planning Commission. I would hate to actually take that opportunity away from them.
Well, so that's different than I think what we've been talking about. I agree. I think that if we talk about leveraging and improving and bolstering the NDAs and the leadership there and incorporating that, or empowering that body, that's an existing, it's a structure that we have.
But wasn't one of the, I can't remember exactly which counselor it was, but wasn't there a final suggestion, maybe you'll remember, Commissioner Macy, that we utilize that existing structure to create this body? We have people who are already invested, people informed, and, kind of really stepping up and already taking on a lot of this, what conceivably it could be, just to use them, continue to use that group to maybe form the CIAC?
So, yeah, I mean, I think as long as, my perspective is, have we really looked to see if we can maximize what we already have in order to achieve some of these goals, which would include the NDAs and the leadership therein, instead of like standing up some new things.
One other thing to note is this community engagement was one of the city council's goals. They're continuing to work on this. They have a group from Portland State evaluating our efforts on public involvement. There's no report yet. I don't know where the council wants to go with the broader topic. So, I mean, I think wherever you guys can make a recommendation about what you think is the right thing to do, but I don't know that you can actually second guess kind of where they're going to be at this point. So you might as well just kind of make your recommendation and understand that there's some other things going on.
All right, well, let's move on from this topic, because I think we're going to be revisiting it on the 28th. You're going to come back with what some other cities are done. I would suggest within that, if there's any evaluation that exists of what other cities have done that can demonstrate results, that would be helpful as well.
Right, and I may ask the city manager or the assistant city manager to come and provide some information.
Great, okay. What's another one?
Yeah, this one was pretty straightforward, and I don't think there was a lot going into it, but we had proposed some edits, so there was no real substantive changes. It was just trying to provide additional clarity within it. So you're welcome to comment on this, or just kind of say that you kind of agree. It basically just, if you look at, or so you don't have that attachment, hold on.
So many documents here. Attachment 4, right? Comp plan and land use designations.
Correct. So yeah, these are just shown in the red in the track changes. They're very minor. They just basically broke out the density ranges for individual zoning districts, and so we thought that was a pretty simple solution to the comments that were provided on this. And so I don't know how much discussion we need to have on this topic.
And again, this is something that we might change after we get deeper into the housing code piece, because we're going to look at whether the maps are the way we, whether that's the structure that we want to use.
And we do note that in the two paragraphs, or in the second paragraph, preceding the description of the land use designations.
Wasn't there talk about eliminating the R5 or making it a medium or a low density and then making the other two high?
There is, but we're not proposing any actual change. This was basically just compiling what's on the books, knowing that we're going to be discussing that over the next year as we discuss the middle housing code work. And so we didn't want to touch any of that and propose any edits at this point, because I think we really needs to be part of the community outreach, specifically related to middle housing and how we tackle that and where R5 should live. And do we need, as Denny mentioned before, do we need as many zones as we do? We have 8 zoning districts for 8 residential zoning districts, 10 when you include the PD zones for a city of 21,000 people. And at first glance, that might be a little bit more than we need.
Any other comments on this piece right now?
None.
Okay. And we're moving on. We're going to come back on this one on the next hearing.
I think that, yeah, especially if you want us to explore kind of a standalone CCI, then I think it goes hand in hand with this, and we're going to need, I would agree that, we'll need to probably invite City Manager Ann Ober potentially to come and to discuss, her perspective on this and, programmatically for city operations.
I'm sorry I have to bring this up again, but I guess I don't want city staff to leave with the idea that the commissioners are all for a standalone CCI, because I'm very concerned about a standalone, because my concern is that this committee is too divorced from, again, the content stakeholders, whether it be land use or public safety or budget or anything like that. And I'm concerned that a standalone committee is too divorced from those actual stakeholders in the decisions that are being made and that kind of thing. So the only thing I caution is that I just don't want us to go off with the idea that we all want a standalone. Community Involvement Committee.
At least as it relates to land use issues.
I wouldn't
Just in
have
general.
a problem with, a land use community involvement organization, whether it's adjunct to the commission or part of the commission or anything like that. I have concerns about a standalone community involvement organization that doesn't have a very strong tie to the content stakeholders.
Okay. Thank you. And then I think let's skip this one because we want Commissioner Edge to be involved unless anyone has a 1 minute thing.
No 1 minute things.
Hot
The
thing.
easy answer is mine is no, I don't think that it's too restrictive.
Okay. All right.
In fact, it could be strengthened if you want.
The timing doesn't work out perfectly, but you will be discussing this next time in advance of a council discussion just about what options they have related to floodplain regulation. We've got a work session being set up for them, and it's partly driven by a commitment that we made to the state, DLCD, to make changes to Title 18 based on this audit that they did of our floodplain regs, so that they are consistent with what FEMA is looking for. So they've done that audit, but as we look at the changes that are proposed and we look at our policies, our changes don't go as far as our policies are asking for. So we're not prepared to take the code changes to Title 18 forward until we know where we're going with the policy. And there's just a disconnect there.
Okay. All righty. Any other items that from the testimony or other things that you want staff to bring back to us? I have one. I'll go ahead. So a comment that was submitted by Sarah Gross Samuelson about House Bill 2916 about it's related to temporary shelters. So I would ask that staff investigate if other cities are including language related to that bill in their comp plan or code updates or any kind of reference to temporary or shelters.
So whether they're specifically referencing the House bill within their comp plan, or they're addressing those issues?
Or if the bill has language or things in there that we need to be aware of that would impact the way we look at shelters. I'm not familiar enough with it, but I've just, since it was brought up, I think it's good trigger. There were a couple of comments about shelters, and so I'd like a little bit more attention to understanding the impact of the legislation potentially, but also what other cities are putting in their planning documents around shelters.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Well, I have one more quick thing. And this one's for you, Mary. Policy 4.21 and policy 4.22, they should be flipped so that you talk, and now I can't remember what it is, but you reference your first paragraph or you reference the second policy in the first policy without knowing what that first policy is, so they should be in reverse order. You'll see what I mean. You'll get it when you read it. And the 100-year floodplain map, I'm not sure why it's at where it's at and not in the natural hazards.
Okay. I had one other thought that I think is important, and in thinking about this being a long-range document, and there were plenty of testimony tonight about you know, thinking forward and changes that are going to occur over a couple of decades. And I guess when we heard from the Watershed Council, I found it interesting, the reference to the study that they're doing with the Institute for Natural Resources on water storage. And I guess it just came to me as kind of like one example of things, one example of, you know, we don't know now, but these things, people are studying things and science becomes available. And so I guess this is just more of a comment about making sure that we have this language that enables us to adapt as these studies take place and as more knowledge is available on certain topics, so that we can be adaptive as we learn more, right? And so that's a comment, not necessarily like...
And I want to agree with you 100% because technology can change a lot of things. Technology.
It's getting late.
Can change a lot of things. And what really actually worries me about housing and the way we set up our codes, because I've been on this planning commission now for, oh dear God, 6 years or something, and every year is the newest, the best, the greatest thing that we're going to do. Live work units, blah, 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 blah. And it goes on and on and on and on. And why we just can't just come up with a generic title so that innovation can just arrive instead of being 2 years behind it, trying to figure out how to write code, and the next and greatest thing is already upon us. And I want this document to be looking forward towards the future, not today, because if we're doing this in 2008, we'd be having a totally different discussion than we would today. So.
Anyway.
Video game parlors.
What's that?
Video game parlors.
Yeah.
Where were you for those?
Right? Well, they already have them, don't they?
I'm just saying. That didn't.
A little outdated.
That was one of those uses that, where did this come from? How does it fit in the code?
Oh.
Yeah.
All right.
That's an
Anything
80s
else?
thing.
Any take-home messages for our staff, for our friends in the audience here?
We had the interesting conversation in response to Mr. Clark and his rutted streets, and Greg kind of pinged Denny about triggering increases in density to capital improvements. This seems like a big policy to consider this late in the game, but I'm really intrigued by that conversation. I would kind of structure it not necessarily as tied to capital improvements, because that's just one mechanism by which a street could get improved. They can be improved through other means, but this notion of provisional increases in density when there is a sufficient improvement to the transportation infrastructure. And so I don't want to necessarily request that gets included, because it feels so big and different and isn't represented by any current policies. But if there was energy around it, I'd make a recommendation.
Well, is it too much of a leap to put it in the transportation section, or to,
No, I think we may need to talk about it, because it's in that land use section.
Okay.
Related to what lands might be eligible for zone changes.
Okay.
And that's where it is today, but we would talk about it probably in more detail if we were actually making map changes.
I think there's an opportunity to, potentially add it to policy 8.3.5, which is the last policy within that section where you're talking about, that's obviously specific to comprehensive plan map amendment applications, but you're going to need some sort of map amendment. You don't always need a comprehensive plan map amendment for a zoning map. It depends on what the land use designation is, but, I think there's the opportunity to tie in transportation improvements or future transportation improvements, kind of tying that into, when you're doing a map amendment, it's for a density increase. I mean, you wouldn't be doing your map amendment if you weren't wanting to up the density. So that might be a place where you could add in some language.
If we're talking about connections to high-capacity transit or frequent transit, yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to make sure that you've got a good network. So
a policy might look like facilitate increased density when a complete transportation network is present. I don't know if that's too milquetoast, but
or projected.
Well, we can look at that, though. It's definitely.
I actually, once we started to kind of flesh out Mr. Clark's idea and really kind of nail down a little bit of detailed thought to it, I do really like that idea.
I'm really compelled by it. I mean, you look at what happened in East Portland where they increased the density up the wazoo, but Powell Boulevard had no sidewalks. It's insane, and we don't want to repeat that mistake, but we don't want to hamstring the ability to get the density we need in the face of the housing crisis. So we need something that bridges those two conflicting.
Well, and it can spur both. It can spur your capital improvement projects to areas that are around transit areas,
but again, it doesn't need to be a capital improvement. A developer might choose to fund a greater street network than they would be required to as a simple frontage improvement in order to unlock the density.
Oh, that's even more brilliant.
Yeah.
You didn't even know.
I didn't even think about that. I know.
So should we earmark that for further research and...
I like that unlock the density idea. That was an interesting one.
Very clever for 9:15 p.m. So what do we do procedurally here?
Continue.
Okay, so...
I'd like to make a motion to continue the hearing to a date certain of January 28th.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
The hearing will be continued. Right. All right. Wow, that was lovely. So now we've got more business to do, but we have another hearing to open up here. Let me just get to did everybody see the staff report on that?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess I open it. Okay, the public hearing on file S-2018-001 is called to order and will be continued on February 25th. Date certain, February 5th.
Thank you.
February 25th, 2020.
Do we need a motion?
I need
motion to continue hearing S-2018-001 to a date certain of February 25th, 2020.
Second. Anybody?
I'll second it.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. We will continue that hearing. Okay. Next on the agenda, Planning Department other business / updates.
We don't have anything for you, other than that what I mentioned earlier is there will be a position on the CPIC for a planning commissioner. And currently there's also another city committee recruiting positions for the city hall, what to do with city hall when the city purchases the Advantis building and moves city functions to Advantis. And so they're seeking, I don't remember how many members, it's like 12 members or something. And Commissioner Hemer has asked to be the planning commissioner appointee for that committee. But I think it might be something you want to talk about.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Given the historic value of this building and Commissioner Hemer's role in the history of Milwaukee and the museum, I support that nomination.
Anyone else have comments or thoughts?
Agreed.
All right, look at that. No, I think you'd be great. That's wonderful that you're willing to step up and
Yeah, and
value.
I'm also pro-development too, so it's a conflict of interest.
Competing goods.
That's right.
Great. Well, I think the other item is what to do, thinking about Planning Commission elections. And Denny and I had a conversation today about some options. I mean, it is in the bylaws that we need to have the elections, the first meeting of the
That's
year.
Right.
In some conversations that I've had with Commissioner Edge and with Commissioner Burns as well, I think that there's, not really necessarily a clear interest in the group as I've talked to people, but, there may be things that we want to consider here tonight. I think there's a few options. We can, if people are super interested in stepping up and they know that tonight and they want to talk about that, there's the potential that we can vote to postpone this conversation and give people a little more time to think about it and maybe give some people a little more time to wrap up some other things that they're doing potentially. And so I could remain chair for an extended time until we, pick a date in a few months or something to have the conversation.
Could you clarify, do our bylaws say that you can only be chair for 2 consecutive years?
No, I don't believe so. But you're asking that. Everybody just read the bylaws not that long ago, right?
Well, we didn't read that section.
There's nothing around term limits for chairs and vice.
And I take it Vice Chair Burns has no interest and Commissioner Joseph doesn't have, or Edge?
I have interest. I question my capacity. I have a lot of personal and professional challenges that I'm focusing on right now, and it pains me to pass on the opportunity, and I'm really torn about it, but I just don't think it's the right thing for me to take on the extra coordination challenges that I know that the chair has. I've really enjoyed I like it when you're not here, Kim, because it does give me a chance to exercise that skill set infrequently. And so I'm torn because I think I can do a good job of it, and it's something I want to do personally as an element of growth. I think I could serve. The timing's just not right for me.
And Commissioner Edge is not interested?
Well, he expressed to me kind of overcommitment and capacity, so he serves on a number of things right now, and so indication is that there's some things wrapping up, and so he may have some free or maybe more time available coming up. So that's why just exploring could we vote to
May I ask this? Are you still willing to carry on as chair?
for a little while longer? Yeah, I mean, I think that it's. I would like to see other people play the role as well, but I mean, I'm happy to continue and serve and support this.
And our bylaws just say that we have to have an election by the end of the year, right?
I believe so. I'm looking them up right now. No, it says at the first meeting of the year, you'll elect officers, is what it says. So what we talked about was, well, we could elect Kim to be the interim chair and have a motion to set a date in the future where we'll reevaluate or follow up with a permanent election for the year.
So let's ask Commissioner Massey and Commissioner Roosevelt, are you guys interested in it?
Commissioner Edge had approached me about it, and I had been giving it some consideration. Being that I'm the most junior on the commission, it was kind of something that I wasn't too sure of, but Commissioner Edge had reassured me that it would, that the group is supportive and that it's not just although you play the role as chair, there's other people obviously that are here to keep you in line, I guess, if that's the right term. So I have an interest in it, but I don't necessarily think I'm the most experienced and capable person of setting the role. There's other folks. That's not an answer. I guess I'm interested, but I'm also very cautious of the fact that I'm being very new to the role. Not sure it's right.
I'm willing to serve.
So let me make, I am not, just it's everybody's relief. Personally, I believe that changing over the chair is a good thing, and it makes more of a positive kind of atmosphere in here so that everybody kind of understands what the chair has to go through, because if you haven't kind of gone through it, it's one of those things. I think that both of you are equally capable. Really what it is reading a script and having a telephone call every now and then. You've done it with the DLC, and you know how to steer a ship. This would be my suggestion is that why don't we hold it off until next planning meeting, and Chair Travis, if you are okay with relinquishing your chairmanship, and if Vice Chair Burns decides that all of a sudden he wants to be committed, or he wants to step down from his vice chair role as well, we can let these two talk and see if they want to be chair, and then let them decide when we get it at the next meeting.
Well, I'll throw out an alternate proposal that Commissioner Massey's willing to serve. You'll do a great job of it. Commissioner Roosevelt, you could do a great job of it as well, but being that you're more junior and have some hesitancy, you could take on the vice chair role, which would give you some limited opportunities to practice your chairing skills of the Planning Commission. We have, if you folks would accept those nominations, I would make them and vote on them right now.
Okay.
Wow. Yes, sure. In order to get the meeting over faster, that would be my first.
Sorry to derail your plan there, Greg, but I saw an
No.
This is why you should accept. You're just straight to the point.
Maybe a year from now. Well, you'll be ready for the chair a year from now. So I'm taking myself out of the running for extended period, and I have some regret about that. But I nominate Commissioner Massey for chair and Commissioner Roosevelt for vice chair.
I'll second it.
All right, we have a motion and a second. We'll do a vote. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? All right.
Now, the question is, Chair Travis, do we want to throw our newly elected chair right into the middle of this comprehensive
I
plan
think you
thing?
just did it.
Well, we can make it an effective date.
Effective as of
February 11th.
11th.
I mean, it's up
February 25th, because the 11th.
Look, the biggest issue is going to come is managing the clock and being able to make sure that, the public testimony doesn't get derailed somehow, or if somebody starts shouting in the audience or something.
I also do think like a little bit of continuity on this process might be beneficial for people. But, that's just my own take is if we have someone new sitting in the seat and it's a little bit confusing for people, maybe
I would like to make a motion to make it effective February 11th.
February 25th. Yeah.
February 25th.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to be here February 11th, which is the other thing.
Effective February. I mean, I think the continuity is not such a big concern. I mean, you're here. You'll be able to chime in.
And you can sit next to Robert and help him out. And
Yeah, I'll be your buddy.
Thanks.
Okay.
you got to run the clock, though.
Oh, gee.
That's not in the bylaws. I will continue to volunteer to run the clock.
Well, congratulations, you two guys both deserve it.
Yes, this will be you guys will be great. And
So I'm confused.
You're starting
When do we
What
take
just happened?
office together?
2 weeks.
Right
now.
Technically, right now.
all right. Okay. Well, I think that said, we can move on. If anybody has any announcements, we.
Can I ask about the CPIC committee? Is any one of you particularly interested in that, or should we also want to include Joseph in that discussion?
Well, I thought it was the chair's job to sit on that committee.
Not necessarily, but the chair is welcome to volunteer.
You underneath the bus. We can wait until Commissioner. Do you think he's going to be?
Well, I'd like to get it firmed up next time.
Okay.
So, okay.
Okay. All right. So, hearing no announcements from anyone or discussion items, I'm just bypassing. I'm sure you probably have something to announce.
I do, but I will save it until there's a larger audience here.
Okay, great. Forecast for future meetings, it's on here the 28th, and then February 11th, where the recommendation will be put forward, and then the 25th, the railroad subdivision will finally be coming up. So that's our forecast for future meetings, and we've concluded our agenda, so I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Adjourned.
Excellent.